Our topic this evening is, can we know God by reason alone? So for many people, there are many paths, and there is the mystical path where one is communing with God. There is the revelatory where a person feels the inspiration of God. But there is also an idea of the philosophical and theological path, where building in the Western tradition on the logic, especially of Aristotle, and ideas of philosophers from the pre-Socratics down through Plato and Aristotle and beyond, that you can potentially use human reason in order to understand God, or to even perhaps prove that God exists. But I think what we'll also find as we explore this, as you're using that apparatus, you also have to have an expansive or a different definitions of what you mean by the word God than what, let's say, any fundamentalists in Abrahamic religions today maybe picture when they think of God. And so I'm going to begin with some background of how this approach even came into being. So although the movement led by the historical Jesus was a sect of Second Temple Judaism, so it exists right alongside other historical sects like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. There are these members who scholars variously call the Jesus movement or Jesus people, proto-Christianity, because the word Christian hasn't been coined yet, and many of the distinctive ideas that make the movement Christian in the future aren't present yet. So this movement changed, and within a few decades after his death, it had begun to attract a large number of converts with no Jewish background. And I guess what I mean here is not that it is rapidly overtaking the Roman Empire in the first century or anything like that, although it's spreading all across the empire. It's still a very small movement. But the spread is especially happening outside of the Jewish community, which means the percentage of Christians, as they come to be called, that had a Jewish background originally, continues to decline, and it becomes a minority within the overall movement. So when we're talking about these people without a Jewish background, in the biblical term used for that is Gentiles, which means the nations. Essentially, that just means non-Jews. We also are talking about them as the worshippers of the traditional Greco-Roman gods or Canaanite Mesopotamian gods, what we sometimes call polytheists or pagans, although those are words that are applied later and negatively by monotheists and Christians and others. So, like I say, within just even 2 decades of Jesus' death, missionaries like Paul had planted Christian communities in Greek-speaking cities, actually cities in the case of Corinth, they're in Greece proper. And as a result of that, whereas there had been Jewish minorities also spread all around the empire, many of these converts are not drawn from those Jewish communities, but rather are people from this non-Jewish community. Paul was not the only Christian missionary who was converting Gentiles and building up mixed or largely non-Jewish Christian communities. So even though we know about him best because he is such an effective missionary, thinker, and writer, and so many of his letters survive, whereas writings of these other missionaries mostly don't. And also because when the later history was reimagined by the author of Luke, and especially the author of Acts, it's the same author of a 2-part book, that author is, although traditionally is understood to be a companion of Paul, may not have been or probably wasn't, but is nevertheless idealizes Paul. And so as a result, Paul, we know more about, and more stories are told about him than any of these other early followers. Nevertheless, Paul's own writings give us evidence that he was hardly alone at this, because in his last and biggest, most important letter to the Romans, he talks about all of these missionaries and apostles who were there, and some of them, he says, were Christians before he ever became a Christian. And again, it's a community that he didn't found. So there's a large Christian community there, mixed community, some of whom have Jewish background, a lot of them don't. And he is not the one who founded it. So there must have been many others like that. So nevertheless, Paul had a special knack for converting non-Jews, converting the Gentiles, and he himself saw it as his personal calling to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and he tried to get other leaders, the historical disciples of Jesus, to recognize that special calling. So he wanted Jesus' brother James and Jesus' apostles, Peter and John, to sort of recognize that he had a calling as apostle to the Gentiles. And it's misspelled there, apostle. Anyway, so in his first surviving letter to the Christian community that he planted in that Greek city of Corinth, Paul reflects on the need that a person has. If you're going to be an effective missionary, if you're going to be a good salesperson, you have to deliver that message to different audiences. And so he contrasts what he has found to be effective when he's talking to people who are observant Jews and trying to share the gospel with them. And then that's different from when he meets a Greek-speaking non-Jew, a Gentile, a pagan, what they maybe want to hear. And so we read in that letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20, "Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of the proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews," Paul says, "asks for signs, and Greeks desire wisdom. But we," that is Paul, "proclaims Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and Christ the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength." Okay, that packs a lot in. This, though, is, I think, quite a revealing passage. And I think it also shows why Paul is so effective as a spokesman for Christianity, salesman for this marketplace. Because it begins by showing that he understands who his audience is, who are the people that he is trying to convert, to make this sale effectively. So Paul is writing in Greek to Greeks, and he's been attempting to convert them to what had primarily been a Jewish religion, which is still predominantly led by apostles who were Jewish or who had a Jewish background. So when he tells this audience then, his prospective converts, this Greek audience, he says the Jews ask for signs and Greeks desire wisdom. He's playing on their kind of inherent biases, what they think is so good about themselves as people who are engaging in Hellenistic culture as opposed to Paul's own culture, the Jewish culture. So in other words, as Greeks, these people that Paul is talking to, they're not credulous people who are going to be moved by somebody performing a few magic tricks. They're not interested in signs and miracles. They are motivated by reason. So essentially he's buttering them up in saying this. So this is the context, obviously, of Hellenistic culture, beginning with Socrates and the pre-Socratic, so then Socrates and his incredibly influential student Plato. Traditional Greek religion had undergone sort of massive reform as people who called themselves the lovers of wisdom, the philosophers, sought the meaning and the source of life through using logic and reason. In other words, they're wanting to use logos rather than the inherited tradition and sacred story provided by the poets like Homer and Hesiod, the mythos. And so to appeal to Greeks, Paul has to argue within that context of making appeals to reason. This has been going on for 600-700 years within the culture that he is talking to. And Paul admits in that passage that many people who are wise Greeks, that is to say, we're not just talking about ethnic Greeks from what we now think of as Greece or the coastline of Western Turkey. So when we're talking about Greeks, it's not just the original ethnic Greeks, but many people have been Hellenized over the course of the Hellenistic age. So all kinds of Anatolians are now Greek-speaking and so on, same thing in the East. So these are people that have been participating in this Hellenistic society. Paul has to appeal to them. So any good salesperson needs to overcome objections. And so he says, okay, let's look at this context. You have all been in this philosophical tradition trying to know God through wisdom. But Paul argues here that in God's perspective, the world has not come to know God through wisdom. That is, although Plato tried to use reason to know the divine source, his picture may not have fully convinced all of the people in the audience. And so you may want to hear Paul out. He's got another way to go at this. So while Paul implies that seeking proof from miracles is something that only people who don't know any better do, so seeking after signs, that's not what all of you good people in the audience are looking for. He also, though, is asserting to them, I think you guys all know philosophers aren't getting you over the finish line. They haven't allowed you to fully know God. And so here's what I can do for you. Fortunately, I have something that will get you there. I have something that's better than signs, and it's better than wisdom, but it's not because it has neither. The message that I'm giving to you today has both. It has divine signs and divine wisdom that transcend what you've ever experienced, the people, Greeks, speakers in his audience have ever experienced. So let's go back and look at this passage just one more time so we can decode it a little bit more and see what Paul's secret sauce is, and it's belief, we'll see. So, for since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided, through the foolishness of proclamation, to save those who believe. For Jews ask for signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and Christ the wisdom of God. So this Christ crucified that I am proclaiming to you is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. So essentially, this thing that I am promoting to all of you, this gospel, is going to give you both real divine power, not just a sign or a magic trick, and real wisdom, which is to say, participating with the wisdom of God. And the thing that is going to get you there is belief. You have to believe in what I'm going to tell you. So what's the big deal? Your first instinct here might ask, so what? Religions are all about believing in something, so of course Paul's going to ask converts to his religion to believe the things that he's teaching. That's all about belief, right? But we only think that because we are living in a world that has been radically changed by Paul. So Paul has a bunch of influence, and one of them is redefining what religion has to bring belief front and center. The old religions, the religions of the people that Paul is attempting to convert, the religions of the Greco-Roman world, what we would call paganism, they're not built on belief in the gods. The gods include things like the earth that we're standing on, the sky above us, the sun. The river that flows by your town is a god. And it's not just physical or cosmic things that you see. They're cosmic things that we feel and experience, like love, death, fate. So belief is not an issue. It doesn't matter if you believe in death or if you believe in the sun or not. That's not the question that's confronting pagans, and that's not what the experience of the religion was. The old religions were all encompassing traditions, and they were just filled with rituals and correct and incorrect behaviors for how anything and everything should be done. Your goal is to not incur the displeasure of the gods. And when things start going really bad for you, it's clear that you have incurred the displeasure. So there's all kinds of rituals and things that you need to do to try to get back on their good side. We have here a depiction of ancient Greeks about preparing to offer a sacrifice. In the Roman conception of that same tradition of sacrifice, it's meant to be like a sacral contract that you're making with various gods. It's called do ut des, which is I give in order that you will give me. So in other words, these are just a broad conception of how life is lived. So everyone understands there are great cosmic forces. They can capriciously upend your life or end your life at any given moment. And the old religions are about placating these forces, or if possible, getting them on your side, the way for a whole long time Caesar was able to do with fortune that is obviously favoring him all the way up until fortune ceased to favor him. Okay, so the questions were not whether the sun existed, but whether the inherited myths, for example, what Hesiod said in his poems, myths like Helios and Phaethon, where Helios drives the chariot of the sun across the sky, and his son Phaethon at one point asked to be able to drive it and ended up being horribly burned to death and burning lots of the world and so forth. Does that describe the sun in a literal or meaningful sense, or does it not? And the other question is, what about all of these inherited rituals that we have that are designed to make sure the sun keeps in place and doesn't fall out of place and burn us all again, and all of the other things that are need to happen so that we don't suffer from plagues or floods or storms or any other thing that the cosmic forces might affect you. So are all these rituals actually effective? Those are questions for sure, not about belief. So the pre-Socratic philosopher Xenophanes, for example, observed that if oxen and horses and lions had hands and could draw with their hands and do what men can do, then horses would draw gods in the shape of horses, oxen would draw gods in the shape of oxen, each giving the gods bodies similar to their own. And so, but what he's doing here is not what I think many of us in the modern world think. So we say, oh, that shows Xenophanes doesn't really believe in gods. He's saying the fact that Athenians have made all these gods that look like humans, he's showing here that that's absurd. They just made them up. That's not that, though. So that we're informed by our post-Pauline lens of belief, as an argument that these thoughtful Greeks like Xenophanes didn't believe in the gods. Rather, Xenophanes is questioning inherited religion whose anthropomorphism, that is, viewing the gods as though they look and act like human beings, that's become incredibly fixed and literalistic because of developments in art and so much more depiction, and also because of the importance of Homer and Hesiod and other poets within the culture. It's also continuing to be retold in new ways through the, again, religious developments like theater, comedy, tragedy, and so forth, which continue to tell and explore these stories. So Xenophanes, again, as one of these philosophers, people who are lovers of wisdom, working from reason and logic, ultimately concludes God is one. God is supreme among the gods and among men, and God is not like mortals in body or mind. So anybody who thinks of supreme God and names that God Zeus and then pictures him as a man with a beard and so forth, who does things like have sexual escapades beyond a literal wife's back and so forth, that's what's false. So in this, Xenophanes is participating in, like I say, what is a religious reform program that philosophers were challenging the traditions, and that is happening 6 centuries before Paul. So this is very well grounded by the time we're getting to Paul's day, which is why he's speaking to potential converts well within this well-grounded context. So in terms of anthropomorphism, what do the philosophers have to say about myths? So again, arguing from reason in his important influential dialogue, The Republic, Plato concluded that the gods represented ideal virtues. And therefore, every time you read about what they do in Homer and Hesiod, and they are doing things like Zeus turning himself into a bull and going and seducing and then raping a princess from Phoenicia and taking her off to Crete and things like that. That's what happens in the stories. That and all of the other kinds of vanity, petty rivalry, fighting, immoral behavior that is things that humans do, that's not accurate to how the gods actually would act. In other words, those are just stories that the poets have made up, and they're inaccurate stories, and for Plato, unacceptable stories. And so as he is talking about what a perfect society would be if they were to create an ideal republic, an ideal state, Plato suggests that stories like that would have to be banned, so they'd be censored. And the reason for that is, the reason why we need to cut this out of our religion is, on the one hand, it's giving us the wrong idea of what the gods are like, and two, they are precedent for unethical behavior. You say, well, if you go and do some horrible crime, commit a rape or something like that, you say, well, Zeus does it all the time. And so you have that, and so in those are arguments that Plato makes for purging these. There's also arguing against the practices of the inherited pagan religion. So the atomists, who believed that all causation effectively results from random predetermination, the interaction of atoms. So rather than the mainline Greek view of how the universe is physically formed, which is based on elements of air, earth, fire, water, and ether, and so forth, the atomist says, no, water is just made up of tiny atoms, and the atoms are the smallest thing that cannot be broken. They all have been moving around since the beginning of creation, and nothing we really do can interfere with that because we're only acting in the way that was caused before, and so forth. So that doesn't mean, however, that Epicurus disbelieves in the gods. The gods exist as far as he's concerned, and they are actually the happiest of beings. But, he argues, that the gods don't interfere or intervene in any meaningful way in the world. And so anything that you end up doing, you have to do all of these rituals of crossing your fingers and every other worse thing that pagan ritual had made you undergo in order to propitiate gods. None of that has any value, which is why ultimately, we get to a philosophy, the Epicurean philosophy of, living the best life, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, and so forth. So, belief, therefore, is a post-Pauline Western lens that we've inherited, and we've seen that when, in the modern age, people in the West moved out and found everyone else in the world and interacted with them and started to understand Eastern thought, or the thought of indigenous peoples, which lack this belief-centric focus that exists in Christianity. And that has made one of the things that made it difficult for Westerners to put Eastern religions or native spirituality into simple boxes. And it's like, to the extent, again, that Westerners still understand religion as being about beliefs. Like the number one thing, when I say, what's religion? And people say, belief in a god or gods. This is an inheritance from that incredible influence that Paul had on Christianity, and that ultimately Christianity had on a sister-daughter religion, Islam, that is also very much about belief. So I've spent this is a long preface, half-hour preface in this topic, but the reason why is that I find the modern association that people have of religion with beliefs is almost impossible for Westerners to transcend. It's like the thing that I often talk about, medieval people knew the world was a sphere. It's so embedded in people's telling of the Columbus story that his sailors all were afraid that they were going to fall off the edge of the earth, which they were not. They knew the world was a sphere and so forth. Nevertheless, it's just hard for people to wrap their head around the idea that people in the Middle Ages knew the world was a sphere. So Paul is the one who makes belief the focus of religion. And yet, even Paul is not talking about the need to believe in God. So as we've seen in that brief survey that I did of ancient Greek philosophers, essentially everyone in Paul's contemporary world takes belief in a divine source. That's just a given. They all believe in that. So what is Paul talking about in terms of needing to believe? So what you need to believe, according to Paul, is not that God exists. You need to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, which is to say in Greek, the Christ, and that Christ is Lord. And by Lord, Paul is drawing upon an existing theological idea of the divine, where there is an invisible source of everything that is so transcendent that we can have no connection really with that divine source, but that wherever the power of that invisible God is made manifest in the world, God's logos, God's wisdom, God's power, God's glory, wherever that's acting within physical creation, that's called Lord. And what Paul is saying is you need to believe that Christ is Lord. And so that, like I say, is something, as we've seen in lectures that we've done on Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish Hellenistic philosopher who formulated ideas about a divine logos within, Hellenistic Judaism as an idea of how people can actually connect with the unknowable, invisible God. Paul thinks that this is what's important about this new religion that he signed up for, Christianity, that he wants you to sign up for. And so anyway, this is how Paul injects the idea that the belief is essential to religion in a context of religious plurality, where nevertheless all of the people around are not questioning the belief in God or the divine. They aren't talking about belief. In other words, they already have that as a background. But then, over time, after Christianity is able to convert emperors and ultimately become a state religion, ultimately in the Middle Ages become the religion, the monoculture. There continues to be a Jewish minority, but essentially it's a Christian monoculture in the Latin West. The essential belief in Paul's proposition then expands to the whole Christian proposition. In other words, we already have the idea that belief is essential, but the little thing that Paul was telling you to believe in is only one of the things we're now believing. We're now believing in the whole kit and caboodle because it's all part of the Christian proposition. And so then at the end of that time period, when we're getting out of the Middle Ages into the early modern people and they're into the early modern times, and we begin to have skeptics who question any part of it, then necessarily that is when people start to question the idea of God. In the meantime, they also thinkers have also started in the Central Middle Ages to to respond to that as a potential question that really wasn't on anybody's mind, or very few people's mind anyway, at the beginning of the whole process. So meanwhile, even though Paul prioritizes belief over things like signs and wisdom, he's not actually condemning signs and wisdom. He was saying Christ is the power of God. That is, in other words, God through Christ performs signs that shows God's power in the world. And likewise, he's saying that Christ is the wisdom of God. That is, God's reason and manifest in the world that humans are participating in, and through wisdom then they can know God through Christ. So as the Logos. And so even though belief becomes important under Paul, Christians continue to seek God through both signs and reason throughout late antiquity, throughout the Middle Ages, and all the way up until the present. And so, this little phrase, oh, it's just Jews who seek signs or whatever, that's nothing that's saying that Christians aren't going to continue to have that. Throughout, like I say, late antiquity and the Middle Ages, there's a whole bunch of Christians who all they are interested in are miracles. That is what appeals to them as their component of the religion. So I have here, kind of the miracle tale of Saint Denis, one of the saints, the founder of, the legendary founder, bishop of Paris, who after he's being martyred on Montmartre in Paris, he had his head chopped off. He nevertheless walks with the head all the way to his resting place in this northern suburb, Saint Denis, and I think all the while continues to preach a sermon before, having that resting place. In other words, that's a sign that this is a true religion because of this incredible power. It's not a miracle that I would say is an eyewitnessed miracle. It's rather a legendary literary miracle that nevertheless people throughout all the Middle Ages took very seriously, and it's just one of thousands and thousands of miracles like that. And in the same way that there were lots of Christians, that's all they were focused on and caring about, there are also lots of Christians who were reading, who are trained, who are clergy, who are thinkers, who are seeking God through reason. And I want to zero in on a couple of those right in the central Middle Ages, Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas. And I want to also, take a look a little bit less thoroughly at contemporaries in the Muslim and Jewish world, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Moses ben Maimon. And I'll just, which we have the English, or the Latin words for all of them are Avicenna, Averroes, and Maimonides. And so we're going to look at how these great thinkers in the central Middle Ages decided that to make the argument as compelling as they could, that they could get to know God by reason alone. So let's start with Anselm of Bec. He's also called Anselm of Canterbury. They're both called. So he is called that because he is at a famous monastery at Bec for a while, and he later becomes an Archbishop of Canterbury. So Anselm is a native Italian speaker. He's from a Lombard noble family in Upper Burgundy. He enters a monastery of Bec in Normandy at the age of 27 in 1060. He had followed another Lombard noble there who was a great teacher and mentor to him. That great teacher, Lanfranc, also goes off to become Archbishop of Canterbury before Anselm does, so he's kind of following in that footsteps. Bec, this monastery, had become an incredible center of Latin intellectual life. So the monasteries are where all of Western culture that was preserved within Latin Christendom was preserved as monks continued to read and teach and especially copy texts, which is one of the most important things, so that they could be preserved. And Bec had emerged as sort of a precursor to the medieval universities that would soon start emerging and growing out of cathedral schools at places like Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and so forth. Because of Anselm's reputation as a scholar, King William Rufus, William II of England, one of the sons of William the Conqueror, nominated him to be Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093. Unlike what some kings will do, a lot of times you want to put like your guy, your crony on the episcopal throne. William Rufus was pretty hostile to actually the church and clergy, is not a particularly religious guy. And so he was happily keeping the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant. So as long as there wasn't an Archbishop of Canterbury, there wasn't somebody to bug him. And because there was a vacancy, he got the revenues of this very wealthy bishopric. But at a certain point, he got sick. And while he was sick, he got concerned that God was punishing him for not having an Archbishop of Canterbury. So he swore that he would nominate one, and nominates a good one, as opposed to somebody who'd just be his crony. And so as Archbishop, Anselm ended up being an incredibly strong defender of the rights of the church. He had to fight against the king a lot. He was in exile a lot. And this is the period of the Gregorian reform movement, which is revolutionizing the church and how it's understanding the Central Middle Ages. We really need to do a lecture on the Gregorian reform. Anyway, his fight with Anselm caused William Rufus to complain, "I hated him before, I hate him now, and I will hate him still more hereafter." So William never really felt like he was ever going to reconcile with Anselm. So one of the greatest thinkers of his day, Anselm, is remembered for defining theology as faith seeking understanding. And so he's living in the 11th century. He's pretty much the heir to the medieval Latin tradition of philosophy as it had all existed and what they had maintained up until that time. And at that point, that included very limited access to texts that were written in Greek. So in late antiquity and in the height of the Roman Empire, people in the Latin West were, cultured people in the Latin West were bilingual. So Cicero prided himself on, fluently being able to study Greek in the original language. And so it's only at the end of late antiquity and the fall of the West that Westerners are no longer learning Greek, even the scholars and leaders, and instead are having to rely on translations. And so one of these scholars who knew both, Boethius, who after the fall of the West is serving essentially as prime minister for the Ostrogothic king of Italy, he has a whole project that he's intending to translate all of the works of Aristotle into Latin, which would have changed the course of Western history because they would have been preserved and known. Instead, he only got through the works on logic, and so those were present, and so people understood Aristotle's logic medievally before being executed by the Ostrogothic king on charges of treason as he was conspiring, supposedly, we don't know, with the East Roman emperors. And so we've had lectures before on Boethius and his really important work, philosophical work, called The Consolation of Philosophy, the consolation that philosophy can give to people who have experienced incredible rises and falls like he was living with. So in addition to having very little of Aristotle, very few works of Plato had been translated into Latin. And so the thinkers in the Latin West really weren't able to access Plato directly, but they did have access to lots and lots and lots of Plato's ideas as they had been transmitted through Middle Platonism and Neoplatonism, and then through the work of Augustine of Hippo, one of the last and greatest thinkers of antiquity, who was such a prolific writer and so influential that he almost is the, I don't know what to say, he's the bridge through which all of antiquity is digested and transmitted onward. And so Augustine, because he was so taken with what he calls the Platonists, he often says that they're wrong about a bunch of things, but he's saying that while kind of reading them and adapting all of their ideas. His thought was heavily influenced by Platonism, And in turn, Augustine's work is built on by thinkers all the way down through Anselm and to the present. And so Anselm, in this goal that he has to use theology, to use reason alone to know God, he writes a book called the Monologion, which means the monologue. And in the Monologion, as he starts, he expresses the goal in his preface. He says, "Of all things that exist, there is one nature that is supreme. It alone is self-sufficient in its eternal happiness, yet through its all-powerful goodness, it creates and gives to all other things their very existence and their goodness." And I wonder if you want to think what that thing is. We probably don't have to, we don't have to have the clue that we're hearing from a medieval Christian thinker and an archbishop when we can say that thing that he's talking about is clearly God, right? So now take someone who has never ever heard of or does not believe in and so does not know this. I think that they can, even if of average ability, convince themselves to a large extent of the truth of these beliefs simply by reason alone. Now, since this could be done in several ways, I will set down the one that I consider to be the most readily available. So this is Anselm's first stab at trying to get a person who doesn't know any better or has never heard of this before, if you could by reason alone prove that God exists. But he doesn't start by saying, God. Instead, he defines God here. So of all the things that exist, there's one that is supreme. There's one alone solely that's self-sufficient in its happiness, and yet it also creates and gives all other things their existence and their goodness. So that's sort of a definition that he's worked into what he means by God at the very beginning of this. So here's his argument in the Monologion, in the monologue. If anyone can quite easily ask themselves the following question, question. So let's ask this question of ourselves. Given that there is such an uncountable number of good things, the sheer multiplicity of which is simply a datum of bodily sense, so we can see all around us, there's all these good things that we perceive, as well as something we perceive by means of the rational mind. So we know it's true intellectually that there's all these good things. So given this, are we to believe that there is some one thing through which all things whatsoever are good? Or do different goods have their existence through different things? So in other words, there's all these good things. What makes them all good? What does good mean here? And so, we can already see that we're working from a Platonic kind of background, because he's already talking about, on the one hand, bodily sense, that is to say, the sensible, the bodily, the material world, that Plato argued is the changeable world that is actually less real than the world that we can perceive with the rational mind, that is the intelligible world, the intellectual world of that which is eternal. For Plato, the ideals or forms that exist that are not changeable. So already you can kind of see that that's where he's kind of drawing from as his source, as makes sense. But then he's also talking about this multiplicity of good things. What connects this word good? So this is drawing upon the ancient question of universals. We have had a whole lecture on universals. It's a big issue. But essentially the idea is there's so many good things. What does the word good mean in every case? How is good connected? How do they relate to a universal quality of goodness that, is there a universal quality of goodness, or in fact, are there multiple different goods that are not all connected to one thing? So let's look at it, dissect it. According to Anselm, there are many things that are good, including, X, Y, and Z, the horse, the chair, and the tree. They're all good. Even though X may be better than Y, and Y may be better than Z, they are all good, but they simply have different degrees of goodness if they're not all as good as each other. So if they're all good, they have something in common that causes them to be good. Otherwise, what else is, why are we saying they're good? Anselm argues there that all things that are good, therefore, depend on that which causes goodness, which we can see as an additional thing here, a yellow dot, and that which causes goodness, therefore, must be very good, and further, it is good by itself or through itself. In other words, there's not something else that's causing it to be good, because it's the thing that causes everything else to be good. And as such, as far as Anselm is concerned, its goodness, it is goodness in the highest degree. It is the supreme good. So that's an argument from, from taking a universal and seeing how, that universal has to be it can't have anything else that is causing it to be good. So Anselm also makes a Platonic argument from hierarchy. So he says, if one considers the nature of things, one cannot help realizing that they're not all of equal value, but they differ by degrees. For the nature of a horse is that a horse is better than the nature of a tree, and the nature of a human is more excellent than that of a horse. Trees just sit there and do whatever. Horses can walk around, but people can talk. So, and to doubt that is simply not human, he says. It's undeniable that some natures are better than other natures. Nonetheless, reason argues that there are some natures that so overtops the others that is inferior to none. So in other words, we have to eventually get to something that is the most superior thing. So above humans, presumably there are angels or whatever, but above that there has to only be one top thing. Because if it just kept on going on and on forever, if there's an infinite distinction of degrees, so that no degree which does not have a superior degree above it, then this leads to conclude that the number of natures is endless, and that makes no sense logically. You can't have that go on for infinity. Necessarily then, there is some nature which is superior to the others in a way that is inferior to none. So those are two ideas, and we'll see other thinkers having similar ones. But Anselm is ultimately dissatisfied with the monologion because it required multiple interlinking arguments like this. And so a couple years later, he tried again in a proslogion, which just means a discourse, with the goal of providing, quote, a single argument that needed nothing but itself alone for proof that would be by itself enough to show that God really exists. So this becomes the famous ontological argument, and this is so-called, it's a modern name for it, from the philosophical term ontology, which means the study of what it means to be, being, the nature of being. So as we've said, another famous ontological argument is that of Descartes, whose proposition cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is about being, right? So how can we prove to yourself that you exist, that you am, that you're being, have an ontology? And Descartes says, well, at the first proposition, I'm thinking, and therefore I can conclude that I exist, that I have being. That's an ontological argument. So the goal of the proslogion, this second essay of Anselm's is seeing theology as faith seeking understanding. Anselm really wants to be able to use theology to craft a simple argument that could be understood by most people, which would use reason alone to prove God's existence. And I don't know that he I'm not sure that he wins on either of these counts. It is a single argument, but I'm not sure that it is easily understood by anybody, and I'm not sure that it convinces everybody. But let's go for it anyway. He's got the goal in the beginning of the proslogion. Well then, Lord, as Anselm is writing to God, you who give understanding to faith grant me that I may understand as much as you see fit that you exist as we believe you to exist. So I've got belief here, but grant me that I may understand as much as I believe, and that you are what we believe you to be. Now we believe that you are that than which nothing greater can be thought. Or can it be that such a thing of nature does not exist, since the fool has said in his heart there is no God? He's quoting there the Psalm. So the fool has said in his heart there is no God, so let us use reason. Grant me the capacity, God, to use reason to prove you are what we say you are. But surely, he says, when the same fool hears what I'm speaking about, namely something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears, and what he understands is in his mind, even if he does not understand that it actually exists. For it is one thing for an object to exist in the mind, and it's another thing to understand that an object actually exists. So already here now, there's a sleight of hand going on. So whereas at the beginning of the monologion, when I was talking about God as a supreme nature, God as the creator of everything and giving existence to everything, the supreme good and so forth, those seem like a more normal definitions for God that we're more used to. Now, in order to make this simple proof, Anselm is introducing I think is a less usual definition of what he means by the word God. And so that definition is that something than which nothing greater can be thought. So as we're thinking, the greatest thing that we can think of, and we can't think of anything greater, that's God. And so that is the basis then for Anselm's ontological argument. We say God is that than which none greater can be conceived. Then we can say that than which none greater can be conceived does exist in our understanding. So we understand that in the intellectual world, in the intellectible world of our mind, and actually the universe of ideas and mind is actually in Platonism superior to physical existence anyway, but in any event, it is something that we can conceive of, so it exists in our mind. Then he posits, well, God might exist in the physical world too. It's possible that God exists. So we're not saying for sure. We know that than which none greater can be conceived, that does exist in our mind, but we're at least open to the possibility that God exists in the physical world. So if something exists only in the understanding, in the intellectual world, and it might have existed in reality, then that thing might have been greater than it is. So in other words, we have it in our mind, it might exist in reality, but if it doesn't, then it would be greater than it is, because existing in the real world, now that we understand in our mind, that's the greatest possible thing. Not existing is not as great, so it's not what we're thinking of. Suppose that then which none greater can be conceived exists only in our understanding. Well then, that then which none greater can be conceived might have been greater than it is. So if a greater being can be conceived than that which none greater can be conceived, that tells us that we're going to have a contradiction. So to avoid the contradiction, it must be false, according to Anselm, that God only exists in our understanding, and therefore God exists in reality as well as our understanding. And so that is his ontological argument. A contemporary monk named Guanilo, who read this, was not impressed, and he immediately penned a scathing response to the ontological argument. He says, I'm writing on behalf of that fool who, quoting the Psalm, Anselm says, a fool in his heart doubts that God exists. And Guanilo wonders if the argument shows that the greatest conceivable being exists. He says, well, let's plug something else into this. it must also prove that we have imagined the greatest possible island in our minds. Then we would get through that whole same rigmarole, and then we'd prove that the most amazing island does exist. But the problem, of course, is that island doesn't exist. In other words, the world isn't filled with things like that we might imagine. And so, nevertheless, Anselm doesn't agree that works. So he says it doesn't work for islands. It only works for a single being, which is not being defined in any other way with any other qualities like a man. We're not saying a man greater than which nothing can be deceived, or an island, or any other thing like that. We are just talking about one single being than which none greater can be conceived. And so as a result, like I said, he actually included in future editions of his book Guanilo's counter-argument and kind of a statement to that effect at the end. So didn't convince everybody, but he continued to be satisfied with it in spite of these arguments. Later philosophers, of course, have not all followed this and been immediately persuaded by it, and especially Kant in the modern times has argued that the problem here is that Anselm at the beginning is asserting essentially that being itself is a quality, and it logically therefore doesn't work. That will be a counter-argument to it. Okay, so I want to look at the time frames of those 5 thinkers that I said I wanted to look at tonight. We looked at Anselm, and so Anselm is living from 1033 to 1109, and that is right as the medieval university system is about to start beginning. And so he is participating in a movement that is essentially proto-scholasticism, the kind of height of medieval teaching and thought. He's followed by a famous philosopher like Abelard, who is one of these very early teachers of what eventually is going to become the University of Paris, although it isn't quite yet. It's kind of a precursor. But I want to look now at 2 Muslim thinkers and a Jewish thinker. The first of these, Ibn Sina, actually predates Anselm, and the second of these, Ibn Rushd and also Maimonides, the Jewish thinker, actually postdate Anselm. But the reason why I didn't start with Ibn Sina is that thought that he represents, that later has a lot of influence in the West, it doesn't get there quite yet for Anselm. So it is thought that is actually then finding its way and being translated by these kind of later thinkers. And so we're going to see that especially when we look at Aquinas, but it is also affecting people as the medieval West, in seeking texts, now suddenly starts to recover Aristotle and other Greek works, because they go to Spain and they find out, which is under Muslim rule, they find texts of Aristotle and Plato that are written, had been translated into Arabic and are there, and they start translating those now into Latin so that they have access to them. But what they find out is that in addition to the kind of Greek to Arabic now to Latin translations of complicated philosophical texts, they have these very helpful commentaries and ideas by Muslim thinkers, which also then get translated and become quite influential in the West as the West is recovering Aristotle. And so, although in the Latin world, people didn't have access to Greek texts, Greeks, of course, continued to be the spoken language in the Byzantine East, the East Roman Empire that did not fall. And in the parts of the Roman Empire that were conquered by Muslims, they're another heir to the Greco-Roman world. And during the Caliphate in Baghdad, Harun al-Rashid, essentially the very height of Muslim power, contemporary of Charlemagne, who is recovering, but is nothing like what is happening in Baghdad. The caliphs translate nearly all of Aristotle's works into Arabic, and so they are available for Muslim thinkers, including the Persian polymath Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. And Ibn Sina is then heavily influenced by Aristotle, and he has the kind of tough job of working to reconcile the ancient pagan philosophers' thought with Islamic theology, which is a kind of a similar task, it turns out, that Christians and Jews end up having, since the Abrahamic religions are also related. And so Aristotle had a system of causation. He's very influenced by Plato, but disagrees famously with Plato on certain things, and that especially includes causation. So Ibn Sina, kind of working from Aristotle's ideas of causation, takes that in order to handle the same question that Anselm did, mostly using Plato as transmitted but through Augustine. So rather than relying on a really complex definition of God like the one Anselm had to create for the ontological argument, Ibn Sina really sees God as the truthful. And so his argument for the existence of God from reason alone is known as the proof of the truthful. And like I say, it's based on Aristotelian ideas about logical contingency. What is the cause for existence? Why do things exist? What are their causes? So Ibn Sina, following Aristotle, makes the distinction between something that is contingent, that is, it needs an external cause in order to exist, and something whose existence is essential. So something that's essential can exist without any other thing making it exist, whereas something that requires something else in order for it to come into existence is contingent. A baby is contingent on having a mother and so forth. Since each contingent thing needs something to bring it into existence, that chain must either have an infinite regress. So every baby is born from a mother who grew up from being a baby, who was born to a mother, and that goes on and on and on. But there had to have been a start where we have an original mother, or whatever it is that is the start of that chain. Otherwise, it'll go on forever. And so, this is the argument. The sage who says that the world is actually, riding through space. That's on the back of a turtle, and so the turtle is what's supporting the world. And then when the student was like, "Oh, that makes a lot of sense," but they asked, "Well, wait a second, what's the turtle on top of?" Well, the turtle's on top of another turtle, and so on. In other words, they go, and so then the student can keep asking about, well, what's that turtle on top of, and so forth. And ultimately, the answer is it's turtles all the way down. But this is one of the big no-nos in Greek philosophy, especially for Aristotle and Plato. If you're getting to the point where you have an infinite regress, that means your logic broke down. So that means there has to be a necessary existent. There has to be something that needs to exist, something that's essential, so that everything else that is contingent can have its existence based on that necessary existent. And so that necessary existent, of course, then for Ibn Sina is God, the truthful. Among Ibn Sina's successors was the scholar Ibn Rushd, who was born in Cordoba, so in Spain, but in the medieval Spain, which is to say Andalusia, the Muslim Spain. And he's part of the very end of the intellectual flowering in Muslim Spain, as it became under a lot of pressure from Spanish Crusaders and so forth. But it's this flowering moment when, again, there's a pretty multicultural society that is vivid intellectually and is also Westerners from the Latin tradition are interacting with it, especially to the extent of getting some of these ideas, copying texts and bringing them into their own tradition, which is one of the things that sets off the whole Renaissance earlier Renaissance. It's the Renaissance of the 12th century that includes the founding of the medieval universities. So Ibn Rushd also produced arguments by which he hoped to demonstrate the existence of a creator, existence of God by reason alone. And so he has two arguments that I think have a bunch of similarities. The first of these he's calling an arguments from providence. So we're saying something's providential, that means something is there's something that's clearly been done with a divine origin that's good. So he observes that the world and the universe, they're incredibly attuned to human life. There are all sorts of things about the planet, how warm it is, how it naturally seems to be perfectly attuned for how humans are, so that we have that, and that implies therefore that there is a creator who is concerned for the welfare of humankind, because the world is filled with all of these good things that are good for us, and so that's his argument from providence. He also has an argument that he says is from invention, and that is, as he looks around the world, he sees, like, for example, the complexity of animals and plants and how they all operate and things like that, and he says, well, that requires that somebody invented all of those things. There had to be some incredible source that is able to have been the watchmaker of the watch kind of thing, as to use a later Renaissance analogy, or not Renaissance, Enlightenment analogy for a deist God. And so those end up becoming, I think, arguments that people continue to make variations of this down to the day, which we sometimes call the arguments from design. So before Darwin's theory of evolution and the survival of the fittest and so forth, before those ideas had been able to be, had been formulated, it was very difficult to explain otherwise, how, again, all of how life could be the way it is. And so one of the things that no one is working from here in the Middle Ages especially is they just had no conception of how old the world was. Everyone thought the world was much, much shorter. And so there's, anyway, not that they were thinking in terms of evolution, but anyway, they wouldn't have that capacity to identify how long, the mechanism could have been to create, to have all the varieties and interesting things and wonderful wonders of nature could have come into being. In addition to those two Muslim thinkers, scholars like Maimonides, which is Moses bin Maimon, participated in the medieval Arabic intellectual tradition. So like Ibn Sina, Maimonides defined God, in his case the God of Abraham, Jewish God, using Aristotelian contingencies. And so God is that necessary being, so that all contingent things which need something else in order to exist ultimately rely on a necessary being in order to have their being. But Maimonides is also influenced by Neoplatonist thinkers, so without having to go through Augustine like the Westerners. And as a result, he also formulated a theology that is called apophatic theology, or he worked in a theology of apophatic theology, and that is talking about God or defining God not by affirming God's qualities, but by saying what God is not. So we do that a lot anyway when we say that God is immortal. That means he's not mortal, and so forth. When we are saying, God is infinite, that means God is not finite. So those are apophatic statements about how we understand God. And Maimonides has those, and again, in his participation in this knowing God by reason, follows Ibn Sina. All right, and so talked a little bit, a lot about Anselm, and a little bit about Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Maimonides. I'm going to now look at Aquinas' thought, because he has access to, if not Maimonides anyway, he has access to Anselm, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd. And so just to place them all, Aquinas is here at the end of our chart after the formulation of the university system, and he's someone who has come up in it and also been a major leader of the universities. He's also a student of Albertus Magnus, another one of these great thinkers. So Aquinas also sets himself the task of knowing God by reason alone. So he is coming now at the other end of this kind of medieval Renaissance of the 12th century. So back in Augustine's time and throughout the what we might call the Dark Ages, in the era when the Roman state collapsed, when barbarians were at the gates, Plato's highly spiritualized system had a bunch of real appeal. But now, as the West is rebounding, and it has a new emphasis on things like technology, like windmills and other innovations, the natural philosophy of Aristotle kind of fit the times better. And as Christian scholars would go to Spain or to Sicily or to Byzantium, and especially Spain, grab new books and start to bring them back and translate Aristotle into Latin. Each new book, filled out exciting components of the corpus of thought, but there were some hitches. So Aristotle increasingly came to be viewed as the ultimate authority on philosophy, and ultimately in the West he becomes known as the philosopher. So when a medieval writer says, as the poet says, they mean Virgil, and if they say, as the apostle says, they mean Paul. And when they say, as the philosopher says, they mean Aristotle. So Christians were, though, unfortunately vexed by the times whenever Aristotle's metaphysics will clash with Christian theology, since they like Aristotle a lot and they'd like to pretend he was a Christian, and they even do, pretend that he's a proto-Christian, but he's not, and so he has a lot of things where he conflicts with Christianity. So for example, Aristotle argued against the idea that your soul could ever exist without the body. That's something Christians don't like. So in contrast to Plato. So Plato does think that you can have the soul without the body, so Christians like that. And he also argued in favor of the world's eternity. So that's something that Christians don't want. They want the world to have been created in the beginning from a starting point. So obviously Muslims shared a related Abrahamic faith, and so like I say, Muslims who had access to Aristotle the whole time had also wrestled with these questions. They'd written their own philosophical theological works, and their answers to those questions became very influential in the Latin West when their works were translated. So Ibn Sina became known in the West as Avicenna, and his books were translated, and they offered lots of strategies for softening Aristotle's teachings that Abrahamic religious people didn't really like. On the other hand, Ibn Rushd, Averroes in Latin, Ibn Rushd was a much more strict Aristotelian, and he also developed a following among kind of the more radical Aristotelian Christian thinkers who were prepared to, let's say, lose more of traditional Christian theology in order to preserve more Aristotle. So this brings us to Aquinas, who was one of the most influential thinkers in Western civilization, and he's also, I'd say, the most famous medieval philosopher. He's often the only medieval philosopher studied if you do a survey course on philosophy. But I've recommended before the series History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, because it really covers everything, including all of the medieval thinkers and also all of the Muslim thinkers. And I've gone to those books in drawing upon for this lecture, for example. So Aquinas is the author of the Summa Theologiae, the Summary of Theology, which is a massive compendium, and it actually still informs Christian, especially Catholic theology. And Thomism is actually an active, which is to say, Thomism, from Thomas Aquinas, is actually an active theological and philosophical school. So Aquinas was born to a minor noble family in the Kingdom of Sicily during the reign of Frederick II, and his family wanted him to become abbot of the powerful abbey of Monte Cassino in the south that had been St. Benedict's Abbey, and it is one of the really important centers. But instead, Thomas joined the Dominicans, which was one of these popular new mendicant orders alongside the Franciscans, and that allowed him to study theology in Paris at the Dominican school. And so one of the goals that he ends up having is reconciling Plato and Aristotle. So Aristotle is Plato's student, disagrees with him on a number of things. That disagreement is sometimes, I think, overblown, because in some ways where we've gotten to now in postmodernism and beyond puts Plato and Aristotle pretty clearly into one camp against that sort of thing. And so the debate, has been at the heart of Western philosophy for most of history. And some thinkers are more Platonic, some are more Aristotelian. Quite a number have sought to reconcile the two. So, for example, Boethius, who we mentioned, felt that Plato and Aristotle could be reconciled, as did Avicenna, and also then now Aquinas. And so, if we are kind of put some of these thinkers that we've already looked at into the ones who are more on the Platonist side and more on the Aristotelian side, so Augustine, and then one of the great thinkers of the Franciscans, Bonaventure, are definitely fully in the Platonic camp, whereas Averroes and some of the what we were calling what Thomas Aquinas sets himself up against, people who what he calls radical Averroists, radical Aristotelians, Sige of Brabant, Boethius of Dacia. These are contemporary teachers for him. Nevertheless, the other things, the famous Boethius and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, attempted a reconciliation of Plato and Aristotle, as did Thomas Aquinas' teacher, Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, and also Aquinas himself. So Aquinas' goal was to show that Aristotle could be reconciled with both Plato and Christianity. And at times he accomplished this a little bit by misreading Aristotle or arguing that the philosopher was only speculating in key places. Nevertheless, he wanted to create a space to preserve Aristotle within Christianity without, and also arguing against the full Aristotelian Christians. This is the context then for the Summa Theologiae, and this exhaustive compendium wants to reconcile Plato, Aristotle, and Christianity. And so within that is Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God by reason alone, and he finds and makes 5 of these, where he wants to argue. And he does this in the form of a scholastic disputation. And so we'll see how that formula works. But essentially, the 5 ways are the argument from the first mover, the argument from causation, the argument from contingency, the argument from degree, and then the teleological argument. And we're probably already hearing some of these. Some of these are going to be familiar. These ideas are recurring. But the argument from contingency, as we saw, that was already Avicenna's, Ibn Sina's argument. It was also the one that Maimonides liked. So Thomas Aquinas also likes that one and includes that on his 5 ways. You'll note that he doesn't have the ontological argument, which he doesn't like, as a more of a fully Platonic argument, as opposed to what Aquinas would like is more Aristotelian arguments. So the first of these, the argument of the first mover, draws directly on Aristotle's concept of motion, which has a dichotomy between potentiality and actuality in order to understand change. And so if there's a ball sitting here on my pulpit and it has the potential, it's sitting there in motion, has the potential to fall down and move, but that only happens when it actually happens. So Aristotle argues there must be an immortal, unchanging being ultimately responsible for all the wholeness and orderliness in the sensible world. So in order to begin that motion, in order to have that change happens, there has to be, an unmoved mover. Within Aristotle's physics, the understanding that everything changes from potentiality to actuality, that something is actually hot, that is potentially cold, and later when it's actually cold, it's potentially hot, that requires everything to be moved from an external force in order to actually affect and achieve that change. And unless that all of those movers go back in terms of an infinite regress, it has to all go back to one first unmoved mover that is the source of all of that movement between potentiality and actuality. And so again, because when there's turtles all the way down, an infinite regress is something that proves that can't be. That's the logical, nope, you're out, kind of call in Aristotelian understanding. That means that there is an unmoved mover. And so when we read how Aquinas puts that in his argument from the first way, he says, if that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that the subsequent movers only move inasmuch as they are put into motion by the first mover. So you can't go all the way, can't be going back forever. There had to be something that started this, because otherwise none of the second mover would ever have ever started moving. So as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand, therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover put in motion by no other. And Aquinas says this everyone understands to be God. So because Aristotelian motion requires a first mover that is moved by nothing else, that gets the whole process into motion, there is a first mover, and this everyone understands to be God. So that's his first way. The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause, according to Aristotle's understanding of causation. And that is what external force acted on it in order to cause it, as opposed to move it. So what's the cause of this thing? So in the world of sense, Aquinas writes, we find that there is an order of efficient cause. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, where a thing is to be found as the efficient cause for itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. And so we were talking about efficient causes as opposed to motion, an efficient cause being of the baby being the mother, right? So you can't be the mother of yourself. Now, in efficient causes, it's also not possible to go on to infinity, because all efficient causes following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate cause is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate can be several or only one. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate, nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate effective causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore, it is necessary to admit the existence of a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. So in this way, these first couple are going to seem very similar, and they're based on, again, Aristotle's understanding of causation. In this case, this is an understanding of the efficient causes as opposed to motion or contingency. The third way, then, is contingency. In other words, in everything that requires something else to exist is contingent, and there must be, therefore, a necessary existent thing, as we saw with Ibn Sina, in order, according to the Aristotelian understanding of existence. And so Aquinas follows the same argument that Ibn Sina had, and he says, therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. And this, he concludes again, all men speak of as God. So after the contingency argument, Aquinas makes a fourth way, And he says this one is taken from the gradation to be found in things. And so we saw this in the proslogion of Anselm, where Anselm was talking about hierarchy. So among beings, there are some more and some less good, some more and less noble, true, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things according to as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according to as it is nearly resembles that which is the hottest. So that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is the uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as is written in Aristotle's book of Metaphysics, number 2. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all of that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, their goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. So again, we're getting to that through an argument of hierarchy. The fifth way, according to Aquinas, is taken from the governance of the world. We see things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end or a purpose, and this is evident from their ways of acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. So without even thinking, being things that can't think are still operating according to instinct, and they always do the same kinds of things. And so it's plain that that's not fortuitous, that doesn't happen fortuitously, but it's designedly. In other words, they do achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. As the arrow is shot to its mark by an archer, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, the same way that humans are directing arrows, all of the other things that are working so well that can't think on earth, those are directed by something, and that being we call God. Then he also, again, scholasticism includes all kinds of objections, and so he replies to an objection. He says, Augustine says, since God is the highest good, he would not allow any evil to exist in his works, unless his omnipotence and goodness were such as to bring good even out of evil. So this is part of the infinite goodness of God, that he should allow evil to exist and even of it to produce good. So that is an objection to, okay, if there is all this greatest thing, how would then evil exist? So, similarly, since natural works for a determinate end under the direction of a higher agent, whatever is done by nature must needs be traced back to God so as to its first cause. So also whatever is done voluntarily also must be traced back to some higher cause other than human reason or will, since these can change or fail. For all things that are changeable and capable of defect must be traced back to an unmovable and self-necessary principle, as was shown by the body in the first article. So, in other words, we are still having this is trying to explain then why there are less good things too within this. That is not saying that there isn't a first principle that's the cause of all of it. So I think what's most interesting to me, is not whether the 5 ways are effective proofs of God's existence, or whether the ontological argument actually proves God's existence, or certainly or also the different ideas of contingency and providence that the Muslim and Jewish thinkers had. But I think it's rather, again, Thomas Aquinas' different definitions for God, the other medieval thinkers' definitions for God, Anselm's definitions for God. So in Aquinas' case, the formulation for God is the unmoved mover, the first efficient cause, the necessary existent, the maximum being, the maximum goodness, and then finally the source of meaning, to which, as Aquinas says, everyone gives the name God. It's similar to, again, the God that Anselm was seeking, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, as opposed to, again, something that is a God that is very anthropomorphic, very limited, very fleshy, or anything like that, that may be envisioned by a lot of people who are part of an Abrahamic religion, be it Judaism, Islam, or Christianity. And so these are just 5 kind of near contemporary. I picked these out because they're within at the same time as each other, and you also just, it's interesting to see as these thinkers are taking that classical heritage and they are trying to apply it within their own time frames, how interesting, how interconnected Muslim and Jewish and Christian thought at this particular moment were, as they are drawing upon these ideas and trying to apply them to how they understand the universe. And so that is my look at this question in this particular time period. It's going to be possible to do further dips into this same topic, but from different thinkers, more recent thinkers, and actually more ancient thinkers. So I want to thank lots of people who've been donating, giving support. I want to thank Michael Forbes, Josh Bedford, Diana Patterson, Galen DaCosta, Charles Reynolds, Jacob Kilgore. Thank you to Dave Salyers, to Ryan Swindle, to Clifton Stuckey. I want to thank Neil Diatley, Ron Wagner, Deborah Wells, Narden O.D. Shoops Crispy, the American Legacy Construction and also Ken Rector Foundation. Thanks to both of those groups. Ryan 3715. I want to thank Roderick Delmico, Lionel Orgy, Ryan M, Demiglut, Discerning Prolifer, and also want to thank Dan Howard, Dave Anderson, Fire Ever Living. I also want to thank Anders Andlister, but also you have a question, Anders. You said, when Paul insisted Jesus be called Lord, what language was he speaking in? Was he using specifically the Hebrew Yahweh for Lord, or is he using word for Lord in another language? He wouldn't have been writing the Tetragrammaton, so he's not writing Greek for Jehovah there. He's writing Greek for the Greek word for Lord, which would have been the word, like Adonai in the Hebrew or whatever. But anyway, so he's using, I don't know the name. I don't speak Greek. I know Latin, so he's using Dominus, right? Lord. It's what the Latin translation of that would be. But he's using the Greek word for it. Kyrios, that's what it is. John Phelps, thank you for your support. John asks a question: Isn't the wisdom knowing what you do or do not believe the foundation religion? Could we say that belief in the soul and afterlife is the foundational treasure of Christianity? So it could be. It's certainly one of the things that a lot of people find very compelling about Christianity. It's not the only people at the time who were interested in trying to figure out the idea of soul and afterlife. So specifically, Plato is already giving a basis for the idea of soul and the immortality of the soul, and that's one of the things that Christian thinkers are drawing upon. But there are other thinkers who are figuring out, coming up with other ways of having immortality, including bodily resurrection, which had already been an idea within Zoroastrianism and Second Temple Judaism, and also things like reincarnation, of course, which is an idea that Pythagoras has, but is also present in the South Asian religions. So in other words, this idea of immortality is something that especially, this across the board in this sometimes called this era where people are moving from traditional religions to the world religions, whether you are going to have some kind of an afterlife or immortality is a major question for people. And so and certainly the answer that Paul has is compelling to people. Normative, thank you for your support. Normative asks, how seriously should we take ancient philosophers' throat-clearing when they say, of course I agree there are gods. Strauss famously regarded these as insincere social strategies, which seems at least plausible. So I think I appreciate that in modern times the people who have that as their background, where they're coming off of a time period where coming out of a mono-religious culture of Christianity, of Christendom, that is now being deconstructed, and so that is so they don't believe in the religion of their society, and so they are also looking back to ancient people whose thinking they admire, and they would like to see themselves in those ancient people. And so what I would say is that no, they're not believing in gods, but they are not believing in anthropomorphic, that the gods are anthropomorphic the way many of their contemporaries would have believed. So in other words, they don't think that they are like the gods the way they're pictured, or they're like the gods the way they are described in stories and myths. They reject that, and so the issue is, I think, the modern fixation of the definition of God and gods, which was way more flexible in antiquity and even in the Middle Ages, because we're even seeing how flexible all of these Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thinkers are in their definition of God. The problem is, in the modern times, having had a pretty fixed picture and definition of God, which people then reject, instead of opening that back up and saying, well, we're not going to believe in this literalism, the physicality, these kinds of things that have been kind of the way God has become to be pictured in our society, and instead we are looking for, we still believe in meaning or something like that, because we have opened up that definition. So that's why I would say they are not denying the existence of gods. It's just they are defining them differently than their less sophisticated contemporaries. Phil, what if it really is turtles all the way down? Won't we all be embarrassed? Thanks for your support, Phil. Yes, that would be embarrassing, right? It's turtles all the way down. All right. So normative says, if we assume a God, I suppose we can make inferences about the nature from the world we observe, and normative suggests then that few of them are flattering. So as the world doesn't seem to be all that great a place right now, maybe, or we're not happy with how things are going, maybe that reflects badly on whatever God that we are assuming, especially if we are making one of the arguments of assuming a God in an argument from nature, like the design ones or something like that, or the providence argument that that was one of the Muslim philosophers was making. So that's an argument. It's what we are going to have to do a whole lecture on Leibniz. So there is an argument that he produced that the world that we exist, his response to the problem of evil, in other words, why is there suffering in the world? Why is this world so terrible? If God is good and omnibenevolent and all powerful and all those kind of things, why does the world that we're observing seem so terrible? And Leibniz's conclusion is that this has to be the best of all possible worlds. So it's not true that we're on a bad timeline and there was a better timeline somewhere else. This is the best possible timeline, because anything else would have caused more suffering. And so the decision has been made by this all-powerful, creator that sets everything in motion, to taking it this way, because any other outcome would have been worse than what we're actually doing, so as bad as it is. So that's, I didn't do it justice. We'll do a whole lecture on Leibniz's argument, and then counter-arguments from Rousseau and so forth. but that would be, one of the counter arguments from that anyway. But not everyone agrees. Winston Barquez, how did Thomas Aquinas critique the ontological argument for God's existence? So I'm trying to think of, I don't remember, I guess I'd have to look it up if he's actually quotes Anselm and doesn't like it. What you can say is that as he rejects it? Yeah, so Leandro says that he goes through and rejects it, he finds that not, but we have to look at what the actual, his proof for why he doesn't think that matters, or why he doesn't think it's compelling. But I would suggest that the way that it works for a Platonist, because like Anselm, because of Plato's insistence that the intellectible world, the world of the forms, is more real than the material world, the sensible world. And so when you are a Aristotelian, Aristotle doesn't buy that. So for the forms for Aristotle are a much, it's not an eternal thing. It's reduced to formal causation. What is the form of any existing thing is not a superior thing, but rather just part of its four areas of causation. And so you can see why then Aquinas wouldn't be bought into it, but we'd have to look at the exact his exact argument. Rainman says, does the oneness of God pre or post-date the Shema? And of course, that's the important prayer in Judaism from Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So it depends on the dating of Deuteronomy. So I think that there is what I would say is there is this entire kind of time frame where what's happening with the Israelite religion is they're moving from just polytheism, they're paring down their pantheon, they are becoming henotheists and having religious practice of monolatry, which is they only worship their one God, and that ultimately evolves into true monotheism. That's happening while other people are having kind of similar transformations. So this is when we have in the Persians, Zoroaster is able to present a monotheist or dualist worldview that again has moved from a kind of a traditional paganism to seeing there's one source of all of this, or one source that is being thwarted by a second source. And so similarly, this is taking place within Greek philosophical thought, where people are saying there has to be, some original cause and so forth. So I'd say that this is contemporarily happening, and so it depends on when we particularly date Deuteronomy. And so we sometimes I sometimes will date it to the very end of the First Temple period, and so it's in the same kind of ballpark. Ricky Palacios says, would Epicurus' point of view be considered agnostic? It could, yeah, I would think so. I mean, I think that it's because the agnostic framework is, again, this modern framework where we're really focused on belief or not kind of thing. And so that's not part of what ancient people were really worried about, but in the sense that agnostic is that you're not, I would say that would be, agnostic is more skeptic, in other words, being what the ancient skeptics are than what Epicurus is at. I guess what Epicurus is at is that he's actually not necessarily agnostic. He is saying there are gods, but they can't intervene, so there's no point. So I guess, I don't know, it's probably not agnostic, but it's in that same kind of maybe camp of what maybe agnostics would otherwise like, or some agnostics may be interested in Epicureanism, but it depends on their definition of what they decide is how you live a good life. So, Phantom Bricklayer says, did ancients distinguish between mind and soul? Yes, there's different arguments that they made, absolutely. And so the whole the whole question of like what is mind is one of the big, philosophical, kind of arguments. And so the different philosophers have different theories of mind, and so soul is different from mind. And so Aristotle here has a belief that in order for soul, in order for your mind to be able to function, it has to be connected to your body because it's an essential component of what's causing your mind. Whereas, again, because Plato has an idea that ideas are more important than the sensible stuff, the mind is able to be apart from physicality and therefore exist on past the perishing of the body. Mary Magdalene says, did God exist before humans existed or before any life existed on Earth prior to 500 million years ago? So, as in the according to all of these philosophical ideas and theological ideas of God, the answer to that is yes. Did any philosophical or theological ideas of God exist, at least to our knowledge, before humans began to think of them? We have no knowledge of them existing before that. So the theological ideas didn't exist, and they have all evolved over the course of history. And so they're very different now than they were. But that doesn't necessarily mean, that only just describes the human understanding of God, if God exists, not God. Jacob says, I love Avicenna's argument. Can you talk about Meister Eckhart's perspective of knowing through unknowing, and that you must empty yourself of your conceptions of God to enter? So the idea, I guess, of knowing through unknowing means you reach a state where the soul and God can meet beyond thought. And so the path that all of these people that we've talked about this week are taking to God is knowing God by reason alone. But what you're talking about now is this, and Master Eckhart is talking about, is like the meditative path. How can we, the mystic path. How can we know God not by reason alone, but by, again, emptying ourselves out to the point where we can experience God? And by the way, Leandro is going to be talking about that. That's what the lecture is next week, the mysticism lecture. Critic Squid said, wouldn't the problem with proofs be that they prove God by making God only an abstract concept? So Spinoza was attacked for this. Why not Aquinas? Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting, right? So, Aquinas does come in for some attacks, but by some people who thought that who did not want to bring so much Aristotle with them, and he thought he was relying on too much Aristotle. But yeah, here Aquinas is regarded as a doctor of the church, and so is Anselm, right? So Anselm not only was not branded as a heretic, but he was made the Archbishop of Canterbury. So yeah, I think that there are reasons why different people with different connections are going to do better when they're making their arguments. So Spinoza, who is Jewish, is obviously not in line to become Archbishop of Canterbury, but in terms of openness to understanding God as an abstract concept, I would say that that's something that's going on all the way through the Christian tradition, beginning when the first, it begins really even with things like the hymn of the Logos at the beginning of the Gospel of John, so all the way back into the first Christian writers. Paul even is, influenced by, some of these, he's taught in Greek writing and Greek rhetoric and that kind of a thing, and so he's aware of, some of these philosophical traditions. And he's building his idea of Christ as Lord on existing Hellenistic Jewish ideas that have already been in keeping with all of that. So I think it's there all the way from the beginning. It depends on and whether you're going to get praise or punishment depends on, a lot of cases, your own position and the politics of the time and who you're picking fights with. So we talked about on that whole list somebody who was also contemporary with all these guys. Another great thinker, Abelard, Peter Abelard. He did end up getting in trouble, but in part just because he ended up having an enemy in Bernard of Clairvaux who was very, very powerful. And yet he didn't get in so much trouble that that he got burned or anything because again, he was also very well placed. So it depends on politics as well. Rain Weber says, is it more likely to find God within the gaps in reason, such as what happened before the Big Bang, before time? It seems to me that where reason falls short, faith bridges the gap. So that's definitely been like a more modern strategy, Rain. So because as we were starting reading these, especially so when we're reading Aquinas, he's really building off of, when we're reading Anselm is really building off of Plato, and when we're reading Aquinas, you really have to be completely bought into all of Aristotle's ideas from almost any of these to make any sense. And because actually we now have, a completely different modern theory of motion from Newton, all of the Aristotelian ideas of motion, those have been completely overturned and disproved. So proving God's existence using Aristotelian theory of motion, we can say, well, since the theory of motion is not how things move or how things work, we can discount that. And so as those things have fallen by the wayside, as Aristotle has been discredited over time in a lot of these ideas, then a lot of these have fallen away. And so then people have said, well, where now are we looking for God if we are maybe not going to be able to use these proving God by reason alone ideas? And that's certainly been one of the strategies. Ron Wagner says, can you remind us the name of the book that you said I used for this lecture? So it's called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And so like I say, it's multiple volumes. And so there's a whole volume of, kind of Islamic philosophy and how it fits into the whole history without any gaps. Like I say, normally what ends up happening is you read a bunch of things about a little bit about the pre-Socratics, and then Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and maybe a little bit about the aftermath of that with the especially the Stoics, let's say, but very little even about, let's say, Greco-Roman moral philosophy. Then almost nothing about the Middle Ages, and then we get to except for maybe Aquinas, and then we get into kind of the more modern philosophy. And so in this case, what's really cool is this the author here just does it all in order, and is even kind of see when I just did this little sliver of it, how these ideas are all in discussion with each other, and that's just out of this little segment. And then if we see how those all go onward, they'll all be connected all the way up to the present and all the way to the past. So Nicole Campbell says, I wonder if one could make a point that we all have a conceptualization of God, and no matter how close or how far or whether we understand it completely, that God understands us completely. So I think that would be Nicole, I think that would be a proposition that all of these theologians would agree with. So in other words, God is able to understand all of us completely, but we are not able to understand God completely at all. And indeed, because the difference between us, who are finite, and God, who is infinite, is infinite, we're all equally far away, which is to say infinitely far away from our understanding of God. Michael Luce says, didn't Kant and demonstrate that God is undemonstrable? And we're going to have to also do a whole lecture on Kant, of course. So I think the way it goes is that Kant argues that reason can't prove or disprove God's existence because God is beyond the limits of possible experience. But we'll have to, like I say, look everything up and do what Kant did. But like I said, he is what a lot of philosophers, I think, regard as pretty solid argument against the ontological argument for sure. Michael Karpowitz says, would any of these thinkers think their knowledge of God's existence through reason is superior to that of people who know that God exists solely by faith? So I think it would depend. I don't think they would think that in the abstract. I think that they might think that about particular people who they might know who know God by faith and who they think know a God that is not how they think God is like. In other words, as these thinkers. So in other words, they might see somebody who they see as a person who's not really a true Muslim, even though they're very zealous, in their belief, who has this belief by faith alone, but is unreasoned, or a Christian, a very zealous monk or friar, or somebody who is doing all of these things that they may, as this reasoned theologian, say is not demonstrating a knowledge of truly knowing God because of all of their behavior, and so I think that they might have those ways of working, but in terms of an abstract, they would say that actually reason and faith are complementary. So Anselm, said again that theology is faith seeking understanding. So it's not that he's getting rid of faith. He also just wants understanding along with faith. Aquinas, despite writing just this immense amount of logical argument and so forth, as he's not just talking about these 5 ways about how we can know God through reason alone, but about every other theological, philosophical topic, he nevertheless, at the end of his life, ceases writing, and he begins to focus on that mystical path where he wants to experience God through that way as opposed to through reason. And so I think that in those cases we can say for sure that that they would see these as complementary. And then Anders at the end here, thanks again for your support, Anders. Anders says, pardon me if I missed it, but did John answer the question, can we know God by reason alone? I think my personal belief is that we cannot prove the existence of God by reason alone. But what I think we can do is understand, as modern people, that what people in the Middle Ages and in antiquity meant when they said God is different from a kind of modern fundamentalist, anthropomorphic, fixed way that people see God today often. And so in other words, that there was a very much an openness in the Middle Ages all across the spectrum here, as we looked in Islam and Christianity and Judaism, and also the pagan forebearers, of being able to have a much more open exploration of a source for meaning without having these sort of fixed dogmatic perspectives. So, all right. So, you want to say something, Landro?
Yeah, and actually, Phil was asking in the chat if this lecture is a prerequisite for next week's lecture. And in a way, no, but yes, because this question that Anders just posed is important. And in a way, mysticism is proposing a different way of knowing God that is neither just using your prefrontal cortex or limbic system capacities of your brain, but is something that is beyond what we can comprehend either by reason or feeling. And so this is what we're going to start talking about in our mysticism lectures next week.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I think that we kind of put these together because they are, as you guys have noted, like different approaches that are also interesting and complementary. So thank you so much. Don't forget to like and share and subscribe and all those wonderful things. We're mentioning again that we have a newsletter and people are loving it. So centerplace.ca/signup. And thanks again.